So my name is Cecilia Fries, and with Julie Seringer, we are coordinating the Global Land Program Working Group for Telecoupling Research, and really happy to have you all here today for our second webinar, where we're going to discuss the really interesting topic of conservation and how telecoupling research can potentially help us deal with some of the challenges that we see there and some of the challenges that telecoupling is presenting for conservation. And we have a really interesting program. So we have Sébastian Boillat from the University of Bern, who's going to start by giving us a conceptual introduction to how the link between conservation and telecoupling research. And then we have Siyu Quin, who is a PhD student at the Humboldt-Universität in Berlin, who's going to give a presentation on describing conservation telecouplings in international conservation projects in South America. And then we have Joel Persson from the University of Copenhagen, who is going to zoom in a bit on a case study in Laos and talk about protected area governance there. And then we're going to open up for discussion jointly. If you have any questions, you're welcome to post them in the chat room, and then me and Julie will keep note of them so that we don't lose track of any questions that might arise. But we will have the presentations first, and then we will open for Q&A later. And then as the last point of my introduction, I just wanted to flag a save the date for our third webinar, which is going to be in September on the 4th. And there the topic will be on modeling telecoupled land use change, where we have an interesting panel of Yue and James who are going to talk about different approaches to modeling. And then we have Birgit Müller, who's going to discuss these different approaches. So if you're interested in modeling, save that date, and we're happy to see you. Okay, so I guess that's my introduction for now. Do you want to share your screen, Sebastian? And take over.
Hi, sorry. Can you see my slide? Yeah, okay. Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much to Cecilia and Julie for inviting me to this very interesting webinar. So I won't be too long because we have two very exciting presentations directly from the field that will come. But first, I would like to give a little bit a few conceptual contributions from the study we have already done in the topic. No? And what I would like to show you is that, in my view, we have had so conservation has been already addressed by the telecoupling community since the telecoupling exists. But currently we are witnessing, I would say, a kind of small paradigm shift in the sense that we are starting to stop talking about conservation and telecoupling, and we are shifting to talk about conservation as telecoupling. So that's the shift I want to show you. And then I also would like to show the connection that exists between conservation as telecoupling and the global justice perspective. And I will show this in the framework that we used to do the study that was done in that topic and published 2 years ago. Okay, so when we look at the literature that has been dealing with conservation in the telecoupling framework, for example, one of the first studies that we find is the study of Jack Liu et al. About the Wolong Nature Reserve in China. And what they did is to look at the flows that connect the reserve with the rest of the world. I suppose that everybody of you knows already what telecoupling is, but just to remind that it's a focus that really emphasizes the flows that connect a place to the rest of the world. So in this case, we have the flows that connect the reserve with the rest of the world, but the conservation area is framed as a given context. So we don't look at how this conservation area came to exist in the first place. No, so that's why I call this approach conservation and telecoupling. And then we have another approach which was also shown by Carrasco et al. in 2017, where telecoupling is framed as the response, conservation, sorry, is framed as a response to telecoupling processes. So you have a trade flow here, and then suddenly you have environmental concern in different spaces that leads to the creation of a conservation area. So in this sense, we are already closer to the idea that how conservation comes to be in the first place, but still we don't have the framing on what are the flows that actually allow this conservation to exist in the first place and to maintain it. So that's why I label this approach conservation versus telecoupling. And then the approach I propose that we should strive to, and I think many works are already also going that direction, including the two works that I show from Liu and Carrasco, is that conservation has to be framed as a form of telecoupling, no? Because conservation area also depend on flows. Without flows of money, IDs, tourists, and species, the conservation context as such, it disappears, it vanishes. We have no protected area where the flows that support this area are cut, no? And then those conservation flows, they interact with the competing flows of resource extractions, and they produce specific social and ecological outcomes. And so the research questions that I propose to focus on is, how does the telecoupled nature of conservation and its interaction with other telecoupling drive local social ecological outcomes? And I think this is important because actually we can ask where those flows come from, and often the flows are tied to a demand. So there's a demand for resources. For example, here you see the demand for land, for virtual land, that comes mainly from Europe and Japan, and also drives displacement of land use to developing countries. But there is also the inverse flow, which is biodiversity aid. So in the global south, many protected areas and conservation contexts, they depend on aid that also comes from this global north. So we have a double demand that comes from the northern countries, which is a demand for resources and a demand for pristine nature, no? So how do those demands interact, and how do they create pressures and winners and losers? So one hypothesis is that, okay, biodiversity aid is buffering in some sense the use of resources that comes from north to south, but on the other hand, it can also add up a burden where local population have to support the two things. They have to support the extraction, and they have to support the burdens linked with the biodiversity conservation. And so we translated this into a framework that I briefly show here, in the sense that we look at the both conservation telecouplings and the extraction telecouplings, in the sense that we look at the distant demand for both nature and resources, and the flows that support it, and also the local actors that enable and benefit from these flows. And then we make another framing, we join another framing, which is we took environmental justice indicator of how does telecoupling affect the local communities, and finally, what are the actions that they take. No? And then I just show a few findings here. We tried the framework with 4 protected areas in 4 different countries. And we found out that in the 4 cases, conservation was very dependent on distant flows, especially tourism and also aid. And this rather tend to encourage specific conservation narrative more into the direction of strict conservation. But in the 4 cases, when we look at the history of the parks, which is often spanning of 20 or 30 years, they all experience a cut in these flows. Suddenly, there was a political crisis. Suddenly, there was a coup d'etat, or there was a financial crisis of 2008, for example, and tourists didn't come. This is happening now, actually, with the COVID crisis. Tourists are not coming to Masoala or to Galapagos, no? And then what happened? Then resource extraction took over, and there were a devastating episode of resource extraction. And this extraction was linked with distant demand. Here, in our case, we found this mainly Asian markets, but also national demand from urban areas. No? And finally, the local communities, they had a bad position in the two, because there were patterns of exclusion that didn't allow them to really benefit from those two processes. No? And also there were resistant actions against the two. So the conclusions that we take here is that telecoupling is a key feature of conservation context in the Global South, because conservation is dependent on distant mechanisms and actors. And those mechanisms are not neutral. They exclude and they include people, and they exclude and they include species and ecosystems as well. And then the dependency of telecoupling for conservation is also limit its effectiveness, and it favors resource extraction outbursts. And then the conservation and the resource extraction are the two of them. The two telecouplings are also shaped by unequal power relationships. It can be coloniality, north-south relationships, but also international ones, for example, relations between least developed or emerging countries, and also at national level between rural and urban areas, which can also involve aspects of coloniality, for example, in Latin America. No? So that's all what I want to say now. I think I was too long already, so I give the word to the next presenters. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Sebastian. That was a great overview to start from. And I think we will just continue on with Siyu. So if you close your screen share, and then we move on to Siyu.
Is it okay? Was it closed or not?
No, you're still open. There should be a small red square.
Sorry, I can't find it.
It's normally underneath your toolbar. It says you are sharing screen, and then there's a small red box. Lauren, can you override?
I only have a Zoom in my browser, and then I have the small screens here with. No, sorry.
Or do you want to just leave the meeting and come back?
Here you go.
Now it works.
Okay,
great.
Thank you. Sorry.
No worries. You're good to go, Siyu?
Okay. Oops, you are not supposed to see that now. 1 second. Okay. Thanks, Sebastian. I think your introduction really saved a lot of my time on background. My name is Siyu Quin. Hi, everyone. I'm a PhD student in Humboldt-Universität of Berlin, and I am also part of the EU-funded project Coupled, operationalizing telecouplings for solving sustainability challenges for land use. And today I'm just going to talk about some exploration I am having now on how to describe conservation telecouplings at scale. As you have already known from previous presentation, that the past years we have seen an increasing amount of biodiversity aid from international north to from global north to global south, and in conservation hotspots like the Amazon region especially, we see a lot of bilateral fund and multilateral fund comparing to other foundation and NGO fund. So from all those growing international involvement in local conservation, the conservation community kind of already evolved from seeing conservation as a local response to the local threats to seeing conservation as some global response to local threats. That's where we see a lot of research on talking about balancing global interest and local interest. However, if we really look at the source of the funding, maybe they are coming from some specific outside socio-ecological systems rather than from a ubiquitous global community. And that lead us to this conservation telecoupling idea, in which if we want to describe it as something different from a global response, we really want to look at which are the distal SES that are interested in conservation in the local area of interest, what kind of conservation responses they are proposing, which are the threats they wanted to address, and what are the targets they are focusing at. And based on that framework, I'm looking at the deforestation frontier in South America as my study area, because the area has relatively, it has like huge amount of biodiversity and ecosystem services. It attracts a lot of international conservation interest, while at the same time it's also experiencing a lot of deforestation and other loss of biodiversity. And the cause of biodiversity loss and forest loss was kind of the same across the space, like mainly driven by large-scale agriculture. And within these 4 countries, Bolivia, Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, I used the international aid data from aid data, plus other spatial data sets to link all those conservation projects with the areas they are intended to conserve. The process I'm using is I use keywords to query the database and get a bunch of data that's related to conservation, land management, and to some extent related to indigenous lands as well, because that's something that in literature has shown quite some impact on conservation as well. And then I coded all the data based on what are their what are their goals and what are the interventions they are proposing to achieve those conservation goals, or in certain cases, they are using conservation as an intervention to achieve development goals or environmental justice goals. In both cases, I included them. And then I try to georeferencing them to the area of interest they are referring to. Sometimes it's more broad, like the whole Amazon region, and sometimes it's more specific, like they will mention a protected area. And lastly, I'm trying to mapping all those flows of international funding and the interest and proposed solutions they carried with that funding transaction to the places they were trying to have an impact on. But this is really just a work in progress. I have reviewed about 4,000 projects, and about 10,000 of them I now have spatial information and their objectives and interventions coded, but I still have another 2,000 plus to review. So please don't share the result in this presentation because they are not complete at all. And I'm really looking for suggestions from you because I'm still working on it. So first we can have a look at what are the objectives. This is weighted by the amount of money the donors spent. An interesting thing we notice is about a little bit less than half of those projects actually have a strict conservation goal that's saying they're conserving biodiversity, nature, and species. All those NAs are they do not have these objectives. So these sections are like they have conservation objectives, which they may say it's biodiversity, ecosystems, or species. I cannot recall all the codes, but there are subcategories within them. And a lot of projects, while they do not say they want to strictly conserve biodiversity, nature, and species as we normally think when we're talking about conservation, they do mention they want to conserve ecosystem services like general natural resources or water, carbon, and forest. And in some cases, they actually were doing conservation with a objective of better productivity, though in those cases, it's normally small scale agriculture, fishery, and other type of things. And if we look at the interventions, not many of them are actually spent on protected areas. A lot of them are talking about land management and zoning, natural resource management, and general management. And a lot of them are also talking about activities like restoration or ecological way of producing, like agroforestry. And only a small chunk of them are talking about incentives. I think it's because the data is relatively early, because the temporal scale was until 2012, 2013, and all the incentives probably coming in a little bit later. Or maybe all the incentive-based intervention for conservation were not from bilateral or multilateral sources, but from private sources, which I'm not quite sure, but that's my guess. But the question is, what are the real concerns that brought all those digital donors into establishing these conservation telecouplings? There are some interesting things we found from the data. One is, if we look at the donors and the sites they are conserving, I'll just remember the right side are the sites, but it's like a lot of names, so don't worry about it. This is the subset of the data where they say the goal is species conservation. And we found some interesting thing here, like the United Arab Emirates, all their projects in this whole database are related to species conservation, and they're all single species conservation. United States plays a big role in species conservation in the 4 countries, mostly because they have the Multinational Species Conservation Fund, and they also have a New World Migratory Birds program together with Canada as well. So Canada also, while they have several projects in species conservation, they only work on migratory birds. Okay, thanks. So in this case, you can see the linkages, the biophysical linkages, that the fact that the birds are migrating from North America to South America actually triggered some sort of conservation telecouplings. But if we look at ecosystem services at the left and more general development as the goal to the right, we can see there are way more donors get involved. And especially now we see Spain emerge as a major donor. Although these was the number of projects, maybe on the money-wise, they are not that big. But anyway, Spain seems to have a lot of tiny projects running in South America and trying to conserve the ecosystem services and doing some sort of conservation as a pathway to encourage the rural and indigenous development, which is more the social connections. I'm not quite sure what's going on with the economic diplomatic part, but I'm guessing, I'm hoping to see if any trade partners will try to avoid certain topics or will be more engaged. Other things we try to do in the future is to look at the spatial distribution of all the interests and to see if they are linked to the spatial distribution of the actual biodiversity targets or ecosystem services target, and if they are responding to or avoiding the deforestation trend experienced in the region. So there are several implications. The first one is biodiversity and nature conservation is maybe not that much a global interest than we expected, although a lot of global interests were carried by the multilateral agencies, which is global interest, but from national level, there are much less national involvement, bilateral funding in it. And there are a lot more things beyond just protected areas that carry some sort of conservation interest or practice as well. There are certain telecoupling patterns emerge and enabled by different concerns and connections, like the species migration, the development of the area, and biodiversity itself, of course. And I think it will result in different combination of intervention and objectives across space or promoted by different donors, but that's something I want to check for the next step. So for this paper, the next step is to look at how am I going to weigh the flows, the spatial unit of analysis, and temporal changes. And there are other things important for the future. I'm running out of time. This is an acknowledgement, and thank you all.
Thanks a lot, Siyu. Really interesting presentation on following the money, of these different flows. I just wanted to remind you, while perhaps we changed the speaker, that you are welcome to ask questions along as we go along in the chat, and then we'll collect the questions so we don't miss out on anything. But now we have Joel.
Share my screen. Can you all see that? I see a nod, so. Hi everyone, my name is Joel Persson. I'm a PhD candidate at Copenhagen University and also part of Coupled. So today I'm going to present some work that I've done together with my supervisors, Ole Mertz, and also my co-supervisor, Jonas Nielsen. But basically what I'll do today is present a case study that I've been working on, which is based on a protected area in northern Laos, and present some preliminary findings that are emerging from that. But first I'll start with some background. One of the pretty much essential tools for promoting biodiversity conservation is protected areas, which is essentially a kind of politically legitimate structure for intervening in local landscapes to try to change land use practices and decision making with the goal of conserving biodiversity and other environmental resources. And we see two kinds of trends with regard to protected areas on a global scale, one of which is this downgrading, downsizing, and degazettement, but we also see more pushes for expansion and consolidation. So with the Convention on Biodiversity, there's some pushes for increasing government commitments to up to 50% from the current 17%. But we also know that protected area enactment has led to some very diverse outcomes in terms of social and environmental implications. And this is because of mainly two reasons. One, social reality is very complex. So local context matters a lot for how these protected area measures influence the local context. And the second relates to how these transnational programs for protected area support are set up and kind of operationalized. And this is kind of links to what Sebastian was talking about, that there are some important, these protected areas, they're not standalone entities, but they rely on lots of distal processes to exist. So we can look at protected areas not in terms of islands of government, but as entities that are co-constituted by distal actors and multi-directional flows of information, discourses, funding, and policy models. And that these flows, they're embedded within this cross-scale or transnational apparatus or system that must be empirically examined. So we therefore need to look not only at how a protected area becomes a legal entity and gains a kind of political legitimacy and national decision-making, but we also need to look at the kind of processes involved in consolidating a particular normative notion of sustainable land and environmental resource use. And also look at how this shapes the particular measures being implemented in a particular area and how these measures interact with kind of local practices of government. And so just some of the bodies of literature that I draw on. For one, I apply telecoupling as a kind of heuristic tool that connects actors and flows across distances. So this helps me to kind of combine the more process-based analysis of flows with the place-based analysis of kind of protected area governance practices. But I still have some challenges in connecting a kind of global system of transnational conservation with the local realities of people grounded in a particular place. And so for this, I'm drawing on scholars associated with governmentality, which is a body of thought that's originated with Michel Foucault, and is essentially the kind of analysis of the conduct of conduct, or the various types of schemes, tactics, and programs that are employed by government bodies to shape different systems of thought and individual behaviors. And one particular aspect is looking at the calculations, narratives, and rationalities that render a place and a people governable from a distance. And also looking at the various tactics of government that are employed for this purpose. And these tactics could, for instance, include ministerial negotiations in national assemblies, or donors withholding funding to get certain safeguards in place. But in the context of protected area conservation, you can think of the different exclusionary and inclusionary practices that are used to shape individual behavior. For instance, sanctioning users who violate regulations or ecotourism payments. So just some of the, quickly on the methods that I use, mostly rely on, or largely rely on archival research. So looking at gray literature and organizational documents, going back in time, coupled with interviews at multiple levels with different actors, and to a lesser extent, participant observation. So if we look more specifically at the case that I'm looking at, so this is a map of global protected areas according to the World Database in Protected Area. And if we are interested in the kind of flows that go to and from, they're involved in building this conservation system in Laos. You can look at the kind of flows that are involved in that. And also how these are mediated by actors and different mechanisms on a national level to then be channeled to our case of Namit Beloy. So for our case, Namit Beloy National Park, what's interesting is how it became the country's largest protected area and its first national park. So it was originally established in 1993, together with most of the protected area system. But it was essentially unmanaged until 2000 when IUCN implemented a local project. And the Wildlife Conservation Society took over in 2002 and focusing mostly on law enforcement practices and social awareness raising. But since then, they've also integrated a few development or livelihood development type initiatives around ecotourism and agro-biodiversity tools. But we also saw 2 extensions being approved in 2017 and 2019, and this coalesced in the kind of upgrade of the protected area to a national park. And this upgrade is quite significant because it's the decision taken mainly to access multilateral funding and signal commitment to global conservation goals, but it will have immediate consequences for almost 100,000 people who to various degrees rely on the resources of the forest. So if we take a look at this map, as we can see, the protected area, because of these 2 extensions, have expanded considerably. And we also see a large core zone covers a large portion of that terrain. And there were some kind of multi-level negotiations and practices involved in securing this landscape as a protected area from alternative or competing land uses. And so what happens to the protected area is very much tied to decisions and processes at higher scales. And this has very important implications for local protected area governments. So we therefore kind of look at the ways in which Namit Beloy as a protected area is embedded in a transnational conservation apparatus or system consisting of actors, discourses, and institutions at different scales and levels. And this apparatus helps to create the kind of alignments necessary for the protected area to exist as an entity and also render certain interventions as more feasible or necessary than alternative ones. And importantly, we also have to consider, as Sebastian pointed out, the kind of competing systems of practice and how this interacts with the apparatus. And at local scales, through local interventions, how it generates certain mechanisms of exclusion and inclusion. So how does this transnational conservation system help to establish the linkages that made Namit Beloy an entity that's governable from a distance, and in particular, making it amenable to certain interventions that seek to change people's behaviors. And first, we can say, helps to provide a language for thinking about protected area conservation. Here, certain discourses help to establish a normative and technical salience to protected area strengthening in general, but also particular interventions at local scales, be they kind of ecotourism or boundary demarcation or separating the protected area into a core zone and a buffer zone. And second, it provides a kind of resources for constructing an institutional apparatus that helps to link actors across scales and tying outcomes to certain government programs and strategies. For example, the Wildlife Conservation Society has a memorandum of understanding directly with the central government, and this allows it to channel funding to the protected area management unit for activities. And by doing so, it can circumvent the normal kind of government hierarchies involved in protected area management. And third, it kind of condones a set of calculative techniques and narratives that help to render the protected area operable by government programs. So here we can think of different mapping exercising tools, surveys. These three features, they kind of help to establish the protected area as an ontological entity that makes it amenable to these kinds of technical interventions. So the kind of key enduring features for Namit Beloy specifically, in doing so, we can identify four. One is this portrayal of Namit Beloy as a ultimate or kind of last viable tiger habitat in Indochina. And this kind of portrayal has allowed it to access certain funding platforms. It legitimated very strong law enforcement practices from an early stage and helped to shape the kind of awareness raising and ecotourism activities. Second, this framing of Namit Beloy as a scalable management model that can be replicated across protected areas in Laos and regionally. This has been a kind of feature of activities and donor narratives since it was created or since management started in 2000. And another interesting one is the portrayal of local populations as a kind of static and undifferentiated collective of subsistence farmers with practices that are ecologically degrading. In particular, different practices of commercial hunting, livestock herding, and shifting cultivation. For instance, there's this notion that local herders, they intentionally place wildlife or cattle deep in the forest to help try to lure large predators and then surround them with traps. And this is to kind of hunt large predators for sale. And this is a narrative that's been an important part of a lot of the program documents that legitimate strong boundary enforcement and relocating cattle herds, but there's very little evidence of these practices taking place systematically. It's mostly based on anecdotal evidence. So jumping to conclusions, I'm sure I've run out of time, but some of the important kind of takeaways from this study so far are that protected areas linked to a transnational conservation apparatus. Conservation measures should be seen as tactics of government whose kind of rationalized intentions do not necessarily reflect reality in the local context, but reflect more a kind of sense-making process in the context of environmental programming at the central level. And these interventions, they undergo certain processes of integration into local practices, and these build on historical legacies and power relationships. And lastly, the enactment of protected area conservation programs can have unintended political ramifications that we need to examine, particularly in terms of how they affect spaces of political expression. So thank you for me.
Thanks a lot, Joel, as well, for very interesting presentation. And sorry for stressing you with the time a bit. So Sebastian, do you want to kick off the discussion with a brief comment on the two presentations? Yeah, keeping in mind that we would want to leave some time for questions as well.
Okay, thank you very much for giving me the floor. I think I'm very happy to see those two presentations. I think they are very much in line with the idea I have of looking at conservation telecouplings. I also see that things have advanced a lot since we've done this first study. So I think on the one hand, the work of Siyu Quin is really looking at the funding flows, which is really the core of the telecouple conservation. And on the other hand, we also have the work of Joel, which looks really closer at also the setting of a local protected area, which is telecoupling lens, and also with a very strong fieldwork component. So I can only congratulate these two people for their amazing work. Perhaps I have small questions, perhaps, that come in my mind. First thing is that I know it's very complex, but I think it's fundamental, the question of temporality. I know it's very difficult because it's very complex. I see the work of tracing back all the flows and then adding up the dimension of time is also making it even more complex. But I was wondering, how do these flows change over time, and what happens when they are cut suddenly? Are those flows stable or are they unstable? I think it's really a fundamental question. I also ask myself the same question for the case in Laos. How have the conservation funding flows and support fluctuated in time, and whether they experienced that kind of cuts? Because sometimes I have the impression that funding conservation and then stopping it can even do more harm than not funding conservation at all. Because then people are used to get tourists and so on. So they get into the market economy, they get into the economic growth, and suddenly the funding stops, and then they rush into the resources to try to keep inserted in those markets. So that's one comment perhaps I can do. But I know it's very challenging, and sometimes we don't have the database that corresponds to. The specific questions I could ask, perhaps I have one for CU, is about the recipient countries. Because on the flow diagrams, we see who are the donors, but then we have 4 countries, but we don't know who is the recipient. We have Brazil, we have Bolivia, we have Argentina, we have Paraguay, And especially I was asking this because you show that Spain is spending a lot for the social aspect of conservation. So I was wondering whether Spain was, for example, supporting more Bolivia and Argentina, which are the former Spanish colonies. And I know there is a big diaspora of Bolivian, Paraguayan, Argentinian people in Spain. So it might have something to do as well. So we have Latin American migrants from Spanish Latin America to Spain, and then they finance conservation. And then we have birds migrating to North America, and then the North Americans finance. It's really nice. I think this coupling, seeing this coupling is really very interesting. And I also see that the difficulty is where we have multilateral organizations. It's very difficult to trace. And so I wonder how could we get more data on them? Because
maybe let's see you have a chance to respond then, and we can take a question for Joel. And then we have some questions in the chat already as well, so we would like to also round around them.
Okay, thanks, Sebastian. Yeah, the temporal thing is what I've been thinking of as well. It's just like there are so many different ways to show the data, to cut the data. And I was debating a little bit on which piece to show today, but the temporal part was definitely one thing. Half of them are before 2008 and half of them after. And when you move later to the time, of course, you suddenly see all those big fundings talking about carbon showed up comparing to the previous time. And if you go even earlier to the process, then they really don't care as much about conservation or ecosystem services. All the forest-related money were more talking about sustainable production. Yeah, so I haven't quite thought about what happens when the funding suddenly disappear. I think that's really interesting. I should really look into that. And for all those things, that's kind of related to the recipient countries, is that when we're talking about the influence of funding showing up or disappear, if we're just talking about in Brazil, in such a big area, it's kind of hard to figure out what's the exact impact and which part of the country they are targeting. So, and also if you just separate them into 4 countries, it's kind of like, looks like everything goes to Brazil a little bit. So the spatial part of the recipients, what I'm trying to do is try to actually link them to a smaller scale spatial unit. For now, I have a bunch of administrative boundaries, watersheds, municipalities or actual sites they are investing on. At some point, I need to decide which level should I aggregate them. And I think at that time, it would be better to answer the questions on where are the places receiving funding at what time, for what reasons, and who are investing there. And yes, actually a lot of Spanish money are in Spanish-speaking countries, as everyone will probably imagine. For the multilateral organization, it's really challenging. Like, how can I know which portion of GEF money is from which countries? But on the other hand, I think the decision-making is different from bilateral cases. So I don't know if in that case, we should still call it a telecoupling or not, because if it's not related from a distal SES, but a bunch of people negotiating and having a conclusion, I don't know if that still fits the framework. Then for all the other international organizations, I think there are research saying first, they are not a big chunk of the money flowing comparing to the multilateral and bilateral ones. And then at least in the case of humanitarian aid, the flow of international organizations, private funding normally follows the flow of the national level aid. I'm not sure whether that applies to the conservation funding as well, but this is some pre-assumption I'm having at this moment as a justification of only looking at bilateral money at this moment. That's it.
Thanks, Siyu. Actually, there is would be a follow-up question from the chat, if we can just ask this now. So the question is from Yue, and she's asking how you categorize the use of the funds, because you mentioned several categories, management, areas, etc. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Yes, I think the question is mainly on how I differentiate between area and management. So for the area one, I'm specifically looking at area-based protections, which are the protected areas, reserves, indigenous lands, corridors, any site-based protections beyond protected areas, but still some area-based conservation, maybe community areas and private protected areas. That's the area protection part. And for the management, it's more broad on like fire management, forest management, water management, land management, zoning, resource management. That probably it's talking about the practice in a more general spatial context rather than specified designations that we say, oh, this area we're going to protect it. Of course, you need, once you have the designation, you need to manage it, yeah.
So thanks a lot, Siyu. So you had a question for Joel as well, Sebastian.
Well, thank you. I try to be short, but well, what came to my mind when I see the presentation by Joel is also the more general context of Laos. I know he knows this country a lot more better than me, but some time ago we were usually often speaking about Laos as a hotspot for large-scale land acquisitions. I know they slowed down a little bit now, but when you talk about the tactics of government and these things, I would like to know what your feelings are in who is really behind, no? When you talk about unintended political ramifications. So did you see that there might be some link in some cases, no? That in some areas you have protected areas which comes as a package with perhaps a concession close to the area, or as a protected area somewhat balancing the fact that they were given another area in concession. Do you find relationships between the two? No, that would be my question. I know it's a very tricky, it's a very hot question, but I would like to know your thoughts. No?
Oh, thanks. I think there are these kinds of negotiations that I get an insight into. It's very like indirect, you know, secondary accounts from people I speak with. So I know that there are some, like with this World Bank funded green growth strategy, and there are also some other bigger environmental programs like Lens 2. And I know that they have some kind of conditions for accessing multilateral funding. And this funding is usually, in this case, was unearmarked, which means that the government was free to spend it on what it wanted to. But I don't know how directly this links to other area-based exploitation of natural resources. In the context of northern Laos, because of the altitude and the mountainous landscapes, there's a lot less large-scale land investments in those areas, and it's mostly kind of contract farming for smallholders and things. But when I spoke about the kind of unintended political ramifications, it's more kind of James Ferguson wrote the Anti-Politics Machine. He talks about these instrument effects of this kind of funding flows, and also the kind of conceptual or discursive implications of large international and transnational programs, and they can influence the kind of practices of politics of people in local landscapes. So he gives some examples, like even though the actual project itself might fail, it can extend certain state powers or certain forms of state power into previously kind of unobtainable areas. And it can be things like infrastructure investments, so building infrastructure that then allows a new agent or a new agency office to be built there, and this can allow certain government officials to access areas that they didn't before. So when I talk about the unintended kind of political ramifications, it's these kinds of mechanisms or processes.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Joel. So we have a few questions both in the chat and also people who raised their hand, but we're also running dangerously close to the 1 hour mark. So before we hit that, we have an option to stay on the call for a little longer to keep the discussion going. But if someone has to step off, of course, that's fine. Then I just wanted to remind you all again that our next webinar is on the 4th of September, and it's on modeling telecoupled land use change. It has a registration link already online. And for those of you who might not be members of the working group already, you can sign up via the GLP webpage as well, and you get our newsletter where we share this information and new papers that are relevant to the community. But we had a question both from Jorge and from Maria, who just raised their hands. So maybe if you want to ask your questions directly with your voice. No, Jorge? Okay, Maria? No, you didn't have a question?
No, sorry, I didn't raise my hand. It might have been a mistake. Sorry.
Okay, we just didn't want to lose out on the chance for that for you guys. Then we had a question from Nicolas. Do you want to ask it directly, Nicolas?
Sure, I can do that. Oh, there's some background sound. I'm on holiday, so. So I was wondering, you know, there's so much international focus on Brazilian Amazonas, or in the case of Southeast Asia, for Indonesian rainforests or something like that. And is this focus really significantly reflected in political focus or on funding data? And especially, are other countries and other biomes, let's say, I don't know, Amazonas in Colombia, or the Cerrado and even in Brazil, or other countries, or mangroves in Southeast Asia, is conservation of these biomes and in these countries suffering from the lack of international attention?
Okay, my take on that is Amazon itself is probably also suffering from the lack of attention and money. Like in general, international conservation or conservation itself is the case where we just lack money and focus anyway. But yeah, of course, you see all those bias between taxonomy and places. I don't think Amazon in other countries are affected as much, because when I was doing my data, I think a lot of them do cover Amazon, the Andes Amazon a lot. But other biomes are, of course, receive much less attention, but they're also smaller. So it's hard to justify what's the right amount of attention and focus. Yeah, I don't know. Anyone else has some good thoughts on that?
I know this was a thing. I remember because when I was working at INPE in Brazil, there was a big discussion on that, because there was they observed that in the years like 2010, after 2012, more or less, when they started to implement the monitoring of the Amazon, then there was a land use displacement to the Cerrado area. But they reframe it as more a consequence of the monitoring system that was implemented for the Amazon. And it was more difficult to implement it for the Cerrado, because the forest, non-forest difference was not so easy to see in the images. No? So this is a thing that depends on the monitoring system, but we can also ask ourselves, well, this very monitoring systems, which was also implemented by the Brazilian government, also had, in some sense, international support. No? So thank you. That's what I can add.
Great, thanks, Sebastian. Are there any other questions? You're also welcome to just jump in with the mic. The last chance. Otherwise, I would ask if Sebastian, if you have any last comment on the overall topic.
Well, I won't take more time. I just want to congratulate our colleagues, and I find really great that we can advance with this idea of conservation telecouplings, and then we'll be very happy to stay in touch with the whole group of people who are following and carrying out this research. No? Thank you.
Yeah, great. It's definitely also a topic we're gonna keep our eyes on in the working group, and we are very happy to facilitate any kind of exchange or meeting or discussion round again on this topic or on other topics. Also, just if you have a topic that you think would be interesting to raise in this kind of format for a webinar, we are always happy to organize that throughout the fall. Yeah, and send us your updates once we advertise for the next newsletter. we will soon get a report on how many people actually read it, which should be interesting and valuable. And as the very final thing on that end is that we are gonna also start a blog. And so if you have any kind of new results, new methods, new data, or just interesting, challenging questions you would like to write a little a piece of text about, do approach us and we'll set it up. Yeah, Julie, do you have anything you want to add?
No, that's perfect. But thanks so much for joining us.
Yes.
And really looking forward to the next webinar on 4th of September.
Great. Enjoy your summers and winters around the world, and see you in September.
Bye.